Welcome, everyone, to our Commute Solutions Summit put on by Get There Oregon, spearheaded by the Oregon Department of Transportation and all of our local partners across the state. Thanks for joining us today at Nike's World Headquarters, as well as online. My name is Kelly Bantle, and I will learn how to use the clicker. I'm the statewide coordinator with Get There Oregon. I serve on Get There Oregon's statewide employer support and commuter engagement team. First and foremost, I would like to thank business services firm CBRE and Nike for the generous contribution of this amazing meeting space and all of the fantastic event support that's made today's Employer Summit possible. So a round of applause to Nike and CBRE. We deeply, deeply appreciate it. And I'd also like to give a big shout out to all of our many partners who've helped deliver today's Employer Summit, including those here in the Tri-County area. We have the West Side Transportation Alliance. Raise your hand if you're in the room. There we go, over there. As well, TriMet, awesome. My TriMet colleagues over here. We have Wilsonville Smart. Go Lloyd is also here today, Metro, and as well, Commute with Enterprise, who we deeply appreciate. As we'll dive into today, employee commutes and work experience play big roles in job satisfaction, retention and recruitment, productivity, and actually much, much more. Yet, higher costs and longer distances traveled for work have made commuting much, much more expensive, time-consuming, and draining for workers. The commute has become a greater pain point for employees and a sizable one for employers, especially those requiring staff to spend more time in the office. We've brought together top experts to illuminate how difficult commutes impact the workforce, business, and economic activity. We'll explore the vital intersection between the commute and work experience and employee engagement, and how improving commutes can serve HR, operational, health and wellness, and sustainable business needs. And you'll get some strategies and tips for building and growing employee commute support programs during our interactive table exercise, which is also an online breakout session for those in the room, facilitated by our experts. And I also just want to say how excited I am to be welcoming as well today some amazing diverse group of Oregon employers who are going to share some insights on how to build employee commute support programs. Plus, just another offering here, if you can stick around after our main program concludes around 3 o'clock, you can get a guided tour of the commuter support amenities here at Nike's amazing campus. But before we fully start up, just a few essentials. Bathrooms are located just outside up the stairs. And if you haven't figured it out quite yet already, you can access free Wi-Fi at Nike free, no password required. Let's now begin today's program. And we'll kick off our summit with a panel that I'll be introducing and moderating. But first, I'd like to kind of dive into where we stand relative to the commute. So let's be honest, commuting has long been a dreaded and despised necessity among workers. Adding to the long-standing burden of the commute is that today commuting costs have skyrocketed. Plus, commutes are now considerably longer in distance and take more time. Chief among the reasons making the commutes more difficult to bear today is that costs have skyrocketed since 2019. all the costs that go into the commute, fuel, vehicle maintenance, insurance, and parking, it all adds up. In fact, commuters who drive alone are spending about 19% of their annual income. That comes out to roughly $8,500 a year to spend just on commuting. I mean, think about what you could do with that money if you could even save like a third of it. That is, in fact, 30% more money spent on commutes than pre-pandemic. Commutes are also getting a lot longer, which made national news headlines last year. The average commute distance has risen nearly 3 times, from 10 miles to 27 miles. And again, that's just one leg of the commute. 3 times longer commute, and that's just since 2019. One big reason why commute distances are longer today is the lack of affordable housing in urban centers and around industrial districts. Notably, we found in our research that intercity commuting across Oregon has gotten far more common today. In fact, across the US, super commutes of 70 miles or longer are now made by about that is about 32% since 2020, 32%, which is a big chunk. And notably, it's new hires who are often millennials, who typically are the ones who commute from the furthest away, which really suggests that many employers are now having to draw from an expanded labor pool to meet staffing demands. And finally, I'd also like to call out today that commute times have increased by 20% from pre-pandemic due to longer distances traveled, as well as growing traffic congestion that has returned post-COVID. A national study recently conducted by INRIX rated the Portland metro area the 19th worst for traffic congestion in the entire United States. According to the study, rush hour commuters spent the equivalent of an additional full work week stuck in traffic last year. One whole work week. That's a lot of time. One of the main reasons for increased traffic congestion is population growth. Between 2010 and 2022, our state's population grew from just over 3.8 million to 4.2 million. That's nearly 500,000 more residents, and more residents really translates to effectively more cars on the road and increased traffic congestion delays. So with this backdrop set on commute trends today, I'd now like to introduce our 2 kickoff panel experts who will provide added perspective on the state of the commute and traffic impacts. Carl, Clint, please come on up to the stage. A round of applause. We're really lucky to have both Carl Riccadonna is Oregon's new chief economist. Carl joined the state of Oregon as, oh, come on, guys, don't be shy. Are you kidding me? You gotta, yeah, have a seat.
There we go.
Have a seat. You got a roving mic there.
Okay.
Carl, you joined the state of Oregon just last fall as the chief economist, and you oversee the Office of Economic Analysis within the Department of Administrative Services, and you provide these objective forecasts on the state's economy and revenue and population. They're widely used across state government, especially for budgeting, which is like a super important thing, and also by the public. I'd like to give a personal thank you for all of your amazing analyses that I have used over the years. Carl has worked as a top economist on a global scale for over the last 2 decades, leading teams highly ranked in forecasting on a broad array of economic categories, including labor market dynamics and inflation. And as well, we have Clint Culpepper, with business services firm CBRE. Clint is an accomplished transportation and mobility manager with a diverse background spanning public universities, local nonprofits, and large corporate campuses like the one we are on today. Throughout Clint's career, he has successfully implemented programs to promote sustainable and active commuting options across Oregon, and as well as the transportation program manager and business services firm CBRE, Clint leads in amazing, innovative employee commute solutions. So welcome to you both. We thank you for sharing your insights today. Let's begin with each of you providing some open commentary to get us grounded in the state of the commute and, importantly, the downstream effects on workers, business, and economic activity. Carl, let's start with you to give us a big picture overview landscape of the macroeconomic factors, this is something I love to talk about, that are impacting commutes today.
Sure. Good morning, and thank you for that lovely introduction. If you can't hear me, raise your hand, but I rarely need a microphone when speaking to a group. I'm a transplant from the East Coast, so I have a very different perspective on commuting relative to folks in Oregon, where for 25 years I never touched a set of car keys in my morning commute, jumping on the New York City subway or the commuter rails into the city. So coming to Oregon was really a eye-opener for me. The picture you had of the guy with his hand over his face at the gas pump. That's me now, because, and I'll tell you why that's me, because I moved from the one state where they pump the gas for you. And I thought I was coming out to Oregon and it was going to be the same thing. And sure enough, they changed the law, and now I have to get out. That was me at that gas station going, how does this work again? I flip the lever up, press the buttons, right? So anyhow, in terms of the kind of macro conditions, I kind of have three points I'd like to address. So one is the macro landscape, which will give us some context for the broader discussion. And so the R word has been surfacing a lot lately, recession. And I would just like to make a few points around kind of the broader economic landscape. And so we surged forward coming out of the pandemic, which is now basically 5 years to the day, when we started locking down the economy. We surged as the economy reopened. Just reopening the doors was a big pickup in activity. We had aggressive fiscal policy. Interest rates were set at zero, and there were other measures to stimulate activity. So we surged out of the gate at an unsustainable pace, which was what the economy needed after being locked down. But this created imbalances in inflation, which we'll talk about later on, and shortages in the labor market. Of course, during the pandemic, the idea was, well, remote work is here to stay, and people were moving to these far-flung locations, which is a big factor of those statistics you were citing, where now commuter times have gotten longer, especially younger people who thought, I'll work remotely. I'll move to Cleveland, Ohio, or Hawaii, and continue working at these jobs. And now the reality is that in many industries and many states, we're seeing these return to office or partial return to office mandates, which suddenly that very remote work setup is much more challenging in that environment, on top of all of the things that are a legacy of the pandemic, like the high inflation that we've witnessed in a lot of categories, but especially hard-hit categories are autos, auto insurance, fuel costs, car maintenance. All those categories you mentioned are particularly hot on the inflation landscape. So on to the kind of recession discussion. So now there's this concern that the economy might be tipping over. Every day we hear new news on tariffs and government efficiency changes and layoffs and all this sort of thing. What I'll say is definitely uncertainty is a negative economic factor. I don't think we're at the point where we need to say the R word just yet. We have a very low unemployment rate nationally. In the state of Oregon, we had a bit of a choppy year last year, but there's green shoots. So it's spring. The green shoots are poking out of the ground. There are also green shoots for the economy. And so it's been a tough year for manufacturing in the state. Construction has been lagging, and the home price situation you described is also very much present. In the service industry, economic performance has been pretty strong. If we look at people who are losing their jobs, they're not having a lot of trouble finding new sources of employment. There is a shortage of labor nationally and also in the state. And so we see that people are able to find that new job before they have to apply for unemployment insurance and run the full course of 26 weeks before those benefits expire. They're only using them for a small fraction of that period. So there's a resilience in the labor market. And we can see now the other part of the coin here with remote work and whatnot, labor force engagement is at a record high in the state. Now, Oregon is number 2 for remote work in the country. Colorado's number 1, Oregon number 2. So we are, as Oregons are prone to do, doing our own thing, zagging when the country's zigging. But remote work has very real consequences. And one of those consequences is higher labor force engagement. And so this means folks who are maybe getting closer to retirement are willing to stick it out for a few more years because of that flexibility. Also, and this is survey data, this is not a generalization, we know that elder care and child care is borne disproportionately by females. And female labor force participation has been a major factor driving these record high numbers. The male participation rate is kind of unchanged. So really has been flexible work arrangements are benefiting female workers, especially. And we can see that in the national data. We see it in the state data. And so there are some real questions that have to be, considered when you think of that, now you're working 5 days in the office. What are your childcare costs? You drop the kids off for, preschool, daycare before the school day starts at 6:30 in the morning, right? It's expensive. It's very inconvenient, right? These are all very significant factors. So just quickly to wrap up then, my office, in addition to all of the forecasts you described, and including your kicker, is also a product of my office. We can talk about, that's another hour of discussion, but we'll save that for a different conference on a different day. But in addition to the forecast you described, the state highway cost allocation study is under the purview of my office. And so Oregon, again, doing its own uniquely Oregon thing. Oregon has a constitutional mandate going back to the 1930s that we pay equally into the transportation infrastructure based on usage. And so this is a very complicated endeavor, but basically we are tracking cars versus trucks, and depending on usage, so miles traveled, right? There's a lot more cars in the state than trucks. They drive a lot more miles than trucks. So in one sense, they pay more. But on the other side of the coin, trucks are heavier. They do more damage to the infrastructure. If a heavy truck rolls down the highway or over a bridge, it does more wear and tear. And so we assess all of this to make sure that cars and trucks are paying fairly into the system based on their usage. And of course, this is how we balance revenue for the infrastructure projects that are so important to commute times and transportation issues in the state. So that's a lot of different things wrapped into one. I'll be more succinct on future answers, but just as an opening remark, I thought I'd lay those things out there.
Well, thank you so much for those insights. And Clint, now to you. Commutes are longer and more time-consuming for workers today. Costs have skyrocketed. Workers are facing a lot of difficult commute realities. So perhaps it's no surprise, really, that job satisfaction, or really moreover job dissatisfaction, lies with the commute. Can you share your perspective on how bad commutes impact workers and consequently employers in the bottom line? What's the kind of downstream effects here of bad commutes to workers and employers?
Yeah, I think in the broadest sense, we see commutes as a push for a lot of employees. So if they are not satisfied with their commute, they're likely to look elsewhere, right? So you get churn in the job market due to that, where folks are looking for jobs that are closer to home, or employers that offer benefits that allow them to get to work in a less stressful, less expensive fashion. So definitely an opportunity for employers to step up and make commuting options both more affordable and more convenient for their employees. And when we look at that, at the employer level, we see that like borne out in retention, right? So if we want our folks to stay, the cost of retraining, hiring, recruiting, all of that, if we don't want to pay for all those things, we've got to pay for things like commuter benefits. So definitely a huge opportunity for our HR teams to work to provide what the best options are for their employees. Yeah, not as long of an answer. I'm sorry.
But a very important one, especially when it comes to, a lively and viable workforce that can like get the job done. I think sometimes it seems that with all of the business priorities afoot, that maybe making employees a priority doesn't become the priority. There are always just so many fish to fry. But the reality, I think, is that, Clint, you were pointing to, there is a big return on investment here, but also when you support employee commutes. But also, too, and again, not to beat around, but that return on investment is having the workforce to get the job done effectively and having the talent that can innovate and produce your product and get it to marketplace and all of that kind of thing. But it's also cost deferment, interestingly enough, that by making investments in employee commutes and supporting them, you're actually deferring costs otherwise spent in having to go out and recruit. And anytime you have staff turnaround, there is going to be some measure of an impact on productivity. Because you need to train up and get that person, working again. You lose institutional knowledge. So, those are really, really, really good points.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, few questions for you fellows. My favorite part.
Okay.
I have a background in journalism, some of you may know. Carl, let's start with you. Many household budgets have been strained by today's higher living costs. Any insights on the scope of inflation impacts on household budgets, such as on purchasing power? And are paychecks keeping up?
Okay, very good question. A lot of different ways to break this up. So first of all, actually, I'm just going to loop back to my earlier question about this HCAS study, the Highway Cost Allocation Study. We do this with ODOT. And so as we think about commuting costs, a big part of that is fuel costs, hence the guy at the fuel pump with his hand on his face. What's very striking to me, Oregon, despite the population numbers you cited, where we've gone over the 4 million mark on population, right? So that was, I think, a 10-year history you mentioned to us. So imagine the population gain we saw over that period, which is ongoing. And if suddenly we say everyone has to return to office, similar to pre-pandemic patterns, the infrastructure simply cannot handle it, right? We have bad enough traffic as it is now. We've added 500,000 people over that, roughly, over the time horizon you highlighted. So that would be a huge stressor on, so Governor Kotek, if you're listening, and also CEOs in the metro area, we simply can't handle having everyone back in the office 5 days a week. That would be a huge draw. But what's remarkable in this HCAS study, we work with ODOT, and part of that is tracking gasoline consumption. And so Oregon last year hit 100,000 EVs, so that's a big milestone. Also, we have hit basically peak gasoline demand. So a little bit of good news as we're talking about some of these challenges facing us. Gasoline demand is forecast to actually trend lower in the foreseeable future. So it doesn't mean there's fewer cars on the road. It just means we are switching to more fuel efficiency and more EVs, those sorts of things. On the inflation outlook, your question, on the inflation outlook, we are nowhere near where we need to be. Now, my last answer, I said we're premature using the recession word. Recession is a great cure for inflation. It's an unfortunate cure for inflation, but if we slow the economy down, that brings inflation pressures down. We're not there. We grew about 2.5% last year, which is faster than the kind of cruising speed for the economy. So we grew faster than we really are able to, which creates inflation pressures in the economy. If we use a Nike analogy, right? If you regularly run, a 6-minute mile and suddenly you run a 5-minute mile, it's not sustainable, right? You're gonna that can only go on for so long. That's kind of what the economy did over the last couple of years, which is why we're having these inflation pressures. At the moment, even though we see, well, the stock market is down year to date or since Trump won the election or whatnot, stocks are still holding up in a fashion that would be inconsistent with the economy sliding into a recession. So the collective wisdom of economic forecasters is that the economy will grow about 2% this year. So a little cooler than last year, but still a very healthy pace. The unemployment rate is at a very low level. Job creation is holding up. So I know we're worried about DOGE and tariffs and all these sorts of issues. When we track the leading economic statistics, we're not seeing much impact yet. It may come. We're not seeing it yet. And so the economy is kind of muddling through, and that doesn't get you to lower inflation, right? The other way of thinking about this, in every single industry, the dominant input cost is labor. And so if your labor costs are high, and if you can't get commuters to come to your office, you have to pay more for workers, right? So this is a factor of labor cost, right? Quality of life. Right? If you have a good quality of life, you might accept a lower pay. If you have a miserable commute, you're going to demand higher pay or other aspects of quality of life. But labor costs are running at a pace that is basically 50% higher than what would be consistent with us getting back to 2% inflation, which is kind of the target for policymakers. So we simply don't have the preconditions there. Labor costs are an input cost. They're also the source of demand, right? So you have high demand. In fact, consumer demand has been faster each of the last 4 quarters. So there's actually a reacceleration happening. You have strong demand. You have high labor costs. Those are not the preconditions for inflation coming down. The last part of that is expectations. So everyone in the room, who thinks inflation moves lower this year? Who thinks it moves higher? Okay. Well, actually, you're consistent with the University of Michigan earlier this morning released a survey of household inflation expectations, and it moved higher. Not only your expectation over the next year, but over the next 5 to 10 years. Collectively, if everyone thinks inflation is not going to go back to where it should be going, that makes the work for policymakers that much harder. So the Federal Reserve, which is kind of controlling the throttle of the economy, if everyone here thinks, oh, inflation will go back to 2%, they've got this. Then when you see egg prices at $8 a dozen or gasoline prices going up, you say, oh, well, it's transitory, it'll come back down, right? So expectations are a very important part of inflation modeling. If everyone in the room says, this is out of control, not going anywhere anytime soon, we're not going to hit the targets, then policymakers have to act that much more forcefully on the levers. And so as we think about housing affordability, a big part of housing affordability is your mortgage rate. And mortgage rates are tied to interest rates in the markets and those set by the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve cannot be cutting interest rates if everyone in this room thinks inflation is going higher. And inflation actually is it's running hot. Everyone expects it to continue to run hot. You can't ease the throttle on the economy. In fact, you have to leave the brake engaged that much longer based on expectations. And so it's a very sticky entrenched inflation landscape.
So we can very well expect inflation to be with us for a while and high costs.
Yes.
And especially when it comes to commute costs, we're probably going to still see some heightened pricing for gas and adding in all of the other compounding costs. It's putting a lot of pressure on employees today. So Clint, yeah, please. Oh,
Which is fine, because I think we both talk loud enough. You all can hear like the two of us without, cool. Good acoustics.
we'll get this.
It's okay.
Here's mine.
I want to ask a question, because you started to pull at a bit of a transportation thread that I want to explore, which is we have CEOs asking for return to office. That's because they've made massive real estate investments often. We're sitting on one right now. And so we as employees are going to do what they ask, or we're going to go elsewhere. But the majority of us are going to stay with an employer that requires us to return to work. Now, because the state doesn't have the infrastructure to support that return to office, what can your office, in its influence, do to, I guess, influence the CEOs to promote transportation options, to get those cars off the road?
Nobody on Zoom could hear you unless you use the microphone.
Okay. How about now? Good? Okay.
Thanks, Aaron.
Thank you. So how does your office and the state government put that pressure back on CEOs and business leadership to provide those transportation options that will alleviate the congestion that we would see if folks did return to office en masse?
It's a very good question, and I think influencing the narrative sounds a little hokey, but it's actually very important.
Absolutely. We're big on narrative here.
Right. So
We're very big on narrative. It's what we do.
Sports analogies.
And
So
sports
keep that
now.
up.
Okay, I'll keep them coming. We were seeing exactly the same thing in New York, right? So, city centers are having these issues where foot traffic is a fraction of what it was pre-pandemic. Anyone reading the Oregonian saw, over the last week or so, the focus on the Portland Doom Loop or the Metro Doom Loop and whatnot. So foot traffic and in office, has its perks, certainly to local government, to the commercial real estate sector, et cetera, et cetera. I think the important thing is to find the balance and to look at both sides of the story, because some workers will vote with their feet and say, I'm simply not coming back to the office. And we faced this a lot in New York City when I was still on the East Coast, where a lot of employers said we can't have a return to office mandate because we'll lose all of our programmers and our engineers and the folks who really can pretty easily work from home. They will go to the other employers who are not requiring that return to office, right? So it's a big quality of life issue, right? That either is quality of life or paycheck, right? To be compensated for the inconvenience. I think it's important to have the conversation about, can our infrastructure handle all of the metro area coming back to the office 5 days a week? And I think that would be somewhat problematic to have that. And also to look at the other externalities, like your carbon footprint. Right, the state has been reducing within DAS. We've been reducing our real estate footprint, and there are huge savings in terms of carbon emissions on commutes, heating and air conditioning buildings. Right, so if you have a smaller real estate footprint, you probably have a smaller carbon footprint as well, and so that is a big part of returning to office. There are there's positives and negatives, but the other factor I would go back to is this labor force engagement in the state of Oregon at a record high. Something unusual is happening there, and it is not disconnected from being the number 2 state in the country for remote work. So there's a time for back in the office, but there are externalities like the engagement of older workers or increased female participation in the labor force, all of these things. And I think having that conversation then turns it into a much broader narrative than the CEO just wanting butts and seats, to know everyone's working, right? There's kind of a broader landscape there. And, the economic dynamic we're in now, I think, is much more balanced, where there's more of a fair tug of war. So post-pandemic, CEOs could not say return to office because everyone would just leave. The labor market was red hot. Things have cooled down a little bit now, so now it's more of a balanced narrative where some CEOs can say, we need you back in the office, but it's kind of a more of an even give and take, and we're finding that right balance. So I think a robust conversation is a critical part of getting to the right balance, not overshooting in the other direction.
So let's talk a little bit more about employer perceptions of the commute. Clint, to you, do you think employers today are more cognizant or aware of employee commute pain than perhaps they were before the pandemic, maybe due to the pandemic really itself and the mass adoption of remote work being so well embraced by employees as really kind of a remedy to commute pain? So where are employers at in their kind of perceptions, and how open do you think they are for that narrative?
I think it's really mixed. I think it definitely depends on the organization, and I think we've seen that bear out a lot. Particularly large employers are the ones that we hear from, right? Because they have the loudest voices, and a lot of those larger employers are the ones driving the return to office. I think we still have a disconnect, certainly within leadership of those corporations. Typically, they're not seeing the same, they're not having the same experience that the employee often has, and so there is definitely a disconnect there. I think what we can do is talk about making that connection for them. You know, we often talk in the transportation world about windshield bias, and I think we fall into those same traps here when we talk about return to office, because the CEO probably has a lot more flexibility in their life to be in the office here in person, whereas the average employee has a ton of unseen factors in their life that they may not be able to have that same flexibility. So you mentioned childcare, you mentioned particularly women in the workforce being hit hardest there. I think that disconnect is certainly still there. So if we can make a better connection in the conversations with HR in particular, when we talk about how HR frames what the transportation options and those benefits look like, I think we have a big opportunity to have those conversations upward, so that we can continue to talk about the need for flexibility. Now, we can have remote work, we can have return to office, or we can have some flexibility there that allows us to work from the office most of the time, except when we can't, right? And so that's often made at the manager level. Certainly like that flexibility from a manager makes employee satisfaction that much higher. And I think then you have that retention conversation again, right? And so if we build that culture within our management and within our HR programs, that's where we get the big benefits, because people do work harder when they're more satisfied with their job. They stay at jobs longer if they're satisfied with their job. So we can provide those tools and that flexibility that's necessary to do that.
So before we open it up to audience questions, I would like for you to look inside your Magic 8 Super Ball and let's do a little forecasting, right, Carl? This is your thing. Okay. Where are things going? Where are we going to perhaps see? We talked a little bit about inflation sticking around a lot longer, but maybe population growth cooling down just a bit, but still high already. Where are we likely to be, like, in the next 6 months to even year?
Okay, very good question. So for the state, first of all, two of our biggest imports in the state, as we're all talking about supply chains and trade tensions and tariffs and whatnot, two of our biggest imports are, you want to guess? Californians and Washingtonians, right?
Our neighbors.
Our neighbors. And so, as we think about the state outlook, we make economics sound very difficult and talk about all these surveys and data points and whatnot. When we want to think about the long-term growth prospects of an economy, whether it's a city, a state, or a country, right, there are two variables we have to track. So this is very simple stuff, not as complicated as we would all like you to think it is. It's population growth and the efficiency or productivity of that population, right? So if we have a country X or state X and it's growing Y% per year, it's pretty easy to have economic growth of Y% per year as well, right? So if the economy's growing, if the population's growing 2%, we can easily have economic growth of 2%. If we all get a little bit more efficient, whether it's through iPhones or ChatGPT or other technology we're bringing into our businesses and factories and whatnot, then we can actually produce more than that population growth rate, right? That's productivity in the economy. If we look at the productivity rate now compared to 50 years ago, it's 2%. So there's lies, there's damn lies, and there's economic statistics. AI is everywhere except for in the economic data, right? So some industries are absolutely being disrupted, coders and programmers and all the things I don't understand. There's definitely disruption happening there. But in terms of productivity growth, the economy right now doesn't look that different from where it was in 1975, right? Population growth, on the other hand, is about half of where it was in that prior period. For the state of Oregon, Oregon has always benefited from our two biggest imports, Washingtonians and Californians. And so fast population growth has allowed the state to grow faster than the national economy for the last quarter century. This is changing now, and the population in the state, we're older, we're having fewer kids, there is less in-state migration than there historically has been. And so the state is growing at about half the rate over the next 10 years as it has over the last 25 years. So the state is absolutely continuing to grow. The population grows about 0.6% every year, but the growth rate is moderating. So where are we in 6 months' time? Depends a lot on what happens with policy out of Washington, D.C., whether it's government shutdowns and what's happening with layoffs and trade tensions and all this sort of thing. My best estimation at this point is that we tend to focus on all the bad stuff that's happening, and we still have a very low unemployment rate. We have very high labor force engagement, and so I think the economy is growing a little slower than where it was last year. But it is still growing. So I don't think we're looking at recession in the near term.
So a follow-up.
Okay.
It sounds like Oregon really hinges on its labor force to be great,
Yes.
to innovate, to grow the economy, to expand what it is we do. That really, here in Oregon, that is kind of a superpower that we have.
We have a very high-skilled labor force, and when we look at those imports from Washington and California and other states, they tend to be prime working-age individuals with more education, so it's a very educated workforce that we are importing or historically have imported. And as long as that continues, right, that's supporting industries like tech, semiconductors, engineering, financial services, lots of high value add types of industries.
So what it comes down to is making sure that your golden goose is laying golden eggs in a happy way.
Absolutely. Now, something I've been introduced to since I came out here, which was part of the reason I came out here, so I knew about it only intuitively, I didn't have a word for it, is something called the second paycheck. And so the second paycheck in Oregon is the benefit of living in such a wonderful state, whether it's the population, the natural beauty, the access to beaches and mountains and all this sort of thing. So there is, as we think about the golden goose and the quality of life discussion and whatnot, right, there's a big difference between moving to Oregon and, some other some other places that may be competing for that same type of talent. People come here because they love the natural beauty and the special things, the wine, the agriculture. There's lots of benefits to living here, and that is part of that quality of life consideration. So the second paycheck.
And that second paycheck, the quality of life, moreover, is really sullied when it comes to sitting in traffic all day.
Absolutely.
And so that's really something we need to be thinking about, and why perhaps employers need, and CEOs especially, need to kind of take a different look at the equation. That it isn't just getting people in the office for productivity's sake and innovation's sake, but it's also making sure that your employees are really happy and that you're preserving quality of life in the larger region. And that was the tip to Clint to chime in.
As Clint suggested, it is very expensive to replace employees. So when there's churn in your business, it is very costly to have to recruit and onboard new talent.
Yeah, I wish I had the numbers in front of me, but you all know how expensive it can be, and we've seen those numbers. And when we talk about like providing a robust transportation program for commuters, we know the cost of providing that is significantly less than the cost of rehiring and retraining. And I think when for those of you that'll be out with us here on campus later this afternoon, you'll see that there are real physical things here on campus that keep people here, whether it's the quality of the buildings and the quality of the food that's available to us here on campus, but also we start talking about those, what happens before you get here, right? Because as you know, when you wake up in the morning, you think about work a little earlier than you want to. You're thinking about it as you're headed to work. And so if we can do our jobs to make that ride here, that transit trip, all of those more enjoyable, then when you get here, you're more prepared to do that. We see this, my previous role was overseeing a statewide Safe Routes to School program. We see that at the elementary school level, right? Children who walk and ride and find their way to school in an active way are more prepared for their day than kids who are driven to school. So we shouldn't expect anything else from our adults as well. I'd say it's heightened even more so for adults because they're going through the stress of that commute.
I always liked taking the bus as a kid. I really do. Hey, let's open it up now to some questions from you. Sydney, who's right in the middle of the room, has a microphone. We have these two amazing experts. Questions?
Hi, good morning. Thank you for the thought-provoking comments. We talked about return to work, and you didn't mention all the real estate that perhaps the state of Oregon owns in Salem, empty offices and cubicles that have no people in them. So how is that affecting our economy, and where do you see that going with your magic 8-ball?
Sure. Well, I will say that, and I don't have the stats at the tip of my tongue, but the state has been reducing its real estate footprint. So again, Oregon zigs while the rest of the country zags. There has been some back to work or back to the office kind of push in the state, but I think we and Colorado and a lot of states that maybe have a bigger tech kind of sensibility are adopting the kind of remote work mantra. And so absolutely, it's a huge savings to taxpayers to be reducing that real estate footprint. And that's exactly what the state Department of Administrative Services has been doing, shrinking that real estate footprint. And then it's a lot more fun to go to work when there's actually people in your building as opposed to spread across huge campuses and whatnot. So there is some synergy that happens when you are in the office, but do it when you need to, not do it just out of rote, exercise.
Other questions?
Are there any numbers on like CEOs seeing cultural adoption through remote work? Because that's a big thing in CEOs care about is the culture that they're building in their organizations. And is remote work affecting that? And the other question I kind of relates to that is the output for remote work. Is it, obviously there've been lots of studies on that, I'm assuming, gone up or down or same? Any thoughts on that?
Speaking to your first point, I think you're sitting in one of the best examples for a place that has spent a lot of effort developing culture. And so, I think here on campus we have all the types of jobs, right? We have tech teams that are working on digital marketplace. We have marketing teams. But one thing that never left campus was things that couldn't be done otherwise, right? So our innovation on campus happened on campus. So throughout 2020, we had buildings that still had folks here every day because you can't test materials without having like the robotics necessary, the entire infrastructure, all of our materials teams, things like that. So they helped keep that culture, I think, alive in ways that other teams could not. And so a big piece of the conversation here about return to work is rejoining that culture. So coming back with those coworkers that had been here the whole time. I think it is really important. I think it can be really difficult for companies to develop a coherent culture without those in-person interactions. But I think we've also been challenged with doing that as some of our tech teams, they do work remotely. They are 100% remote. So how do they develop that same culture, that same attachment to their coworkers, that same kind of cooperation method that does tend to happen in person? I think it's a huge question. I think companies we're going to see a lot of companies fail at it, and I think we're going to see a lot of companies succeed. I would argue that the companies that are run by folks that are like really have their hand on their finger on the pulse of what their employees need are going to perform better. I think we're going to see that bear out a lot in the near future. As far as your second question, that is way outside of my study.
I've always got something to say. So your second question, and there's been lots of survey data. I don't think there's a firm answer on kind of productivity of remote workers. Now, I can speak for myself. I'm a disaster when I work from home, so it's much better for me to be in the office. But most people maybe are not, hopefully not like me. So to Clint's point, first of all, with training new talent, right, and instilling company culture, or in our case, state, government culture, right, with new hires and especially new grads coming out of college and whatnot, it is very hard to do that in a remote environment. So I think that there's a risk for, new grads being shortchanged by not having the proper exposure, and kind of time, face time with, mid or senior level employees to really develop that culture. So that's number one. And I'll go back to my earlier point on lies, damn lies, and economic statistics. There's lots of survey data on initial studies looking at remote work and whatnot, and some of the factors are that people are, there's a strong work culture in this country, and so if you're eliminating your 45-minute commute, you're just logging on sooner or working later, and there's that inability to say, okay, the day has ended. Well, if I get in my car and drive home, it feels like the day has ended. If I'm working from home, well, okay, it's 5, I'll just work until 5:30, and then pretty soon it's 6:15, and then it's 7, and it's like you don't disconnect, right? So I'm not so sure, as we kind of have this inclination, people are less productive working at home. They're putting in longer hours even, and it's not clear that they're less productive. Now, in the lies, damn lies, and economic statistics number, I told you productivity, 2% now, 2% back in 1975. So if there was a big change to work in productivity, you think, oh, well, what does that really mean in economics? It's miles per gallon, right? The same way you look at miles per gallon for your car, this is output per worker, in the economy. Miles per gallon hasn't changed. So if there was a big change to productivity from remote work, either better or worse, we should be seeing it in the data, and it's not showing up in the data.
We have a question online. Do you think a return to work would break the downtown Portland doom loop and revive City Center? It seems like the best place to do it since so many alternative modes of travel connect there.
I got lots of opinions on that. I have a lot of opinions on that. I think one of the largest mistakes that we as a region made was not investing in housing in places that we most needed it. And so we're a little bit afield of the transportation part of this, but had we been building housing instead of hotels, we wouldn't have had the massive downturn that we saw. I think that relates very much to transportation in that if we had created a robust supply of housing in a place that had those transportation options so readily available, all of these conversations would be easier. If a larger percentage of our workforce worked within walking distance of literally every transportation option that exists in the city and within the region, we would have an easier conversation about return to work. So if anybody out there is listening that works in state housing policy, that's where we want the housing. That's where the zoning allows for the most density, so the most absolute units. And then with the infrastructure that already exists, we're not going to have to build out expensive transportation infrastructure that's brand new because it's already there. It's already sitting there waiting for us to use it.
Clint, I'm listening. You said, is anyone out there listening? In fact, the state chief economist also oversees, many hats that I wear, the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis. And so thank you. And so what this is a new initiative in Salem to promote housing development within the state. So the state has a housing shortage, an affordability crisis, not that different from what we're seeing elsewhere in the country. So it's not a uniquely Oregon problem, but aware of this problem at the governor's initiative, right, there has been a big push to address this. And so part of this is at least understanding the scope of the problem. And so what we do in concert with Eco Northwest, which is an economics consulting firm in Portland, in fact, the author of the Doom Loop study, and we can talk about the Doom Loop at the end of the question. But basically, we are looking at the housing needs for the state. So the underproduction of housing that you alluded to, and also the future housing needs based on those two big imports I discussed earlier, aging demographics, migration within the state, changes to the economy and whatnot. Part of this, we also factor in commuting distance and things like that. So they're, with the governor's middle housing initiative, so squeezing denser housing into urban growth boundaries and whatnot. This is setting the stage to at least understand the scope of the problem. We also have a dashboard. So if you Google around state chief economist housing dashboard, that sort of stuff, you'll find a dashboard where we basically go through all of the cities in the state, compare them to their peer cities in the state, and then say, where are you on housing production? Not only high income housing, low income housing, middle income housing,